On the 4th of May, 1942, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the bridge of USS Yorktown, watching the turquoise waters of the Coral Sea shimmer under a deceptive tropical sun, unaware that within hours he would command the first naval battle in history where opposing ships would never see each other, a confrontation that would fundamentally transform warfare forever. The Pacific Theater had become Japan's hunting ground since that catastrophic December morning at Pearl Harbor. Australian coastlines trembled under the shadow of advancing Japanese forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy, emboldened by months of unchallenged victories, had set its sights on Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, a strategic jewel that would place Australia within bombing range and sever the vital supply lines between America and its southern ally. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's Pacific strategy, orchestrated Operation MO with characteristic precision. His plan deployed Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi's carrier strike force, centered on the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, alongside Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue's invasion convoy. According to intelligence documents later examined by naval historians at the United States Naval Institute, Yamamoto believed this operation would draw out the weakened American fleet for a decisive confrontation that would crush Allied resistance in the South Pacific. Yet American cryptanalysts had pierced Japan's naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had performed what military historians would later call miraculous code breaking. They deciphered Japanese communications revealing Operation MO's objectives, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with intelligence that transformed strategic blindness into calculated anticipation. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations in World War II, this code-breaking advantage gave the Americans their first genuine opportunity to challenge Japanese naval supremacy on favorable terms. Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, built around USS Yorktown and USS Lexington, the latter affectionately known as Lady Lex to her crew. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch commanded Lexington's task group, bringing aggressive tactical instincts that complemented Fletcher's cautious strategic approach. These two carriers represented America's thin defensive line in the South Pacific, precious assets that could not be squandered yet had to be risked to prevent Australia's isolation. The Japanese invasion convoy steamed southward through the Solomon Islands, protected by light carrier Shoho and escorted by cruisers and destroyers. Meanwhile, Takagi's powerful striking force maneuvered to intercept any American interference. The stage was set for a revolutionary confrontation where aircraft carriers, floating airports capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles, would determine victory or defeat without their parent ships ever exchanging direct fire. On the 7th of May, reconnaissance aircraft from both fleets probed the vast ocean expanses, searching desperately for enemy carriers concealed beneath tropical weather fronts and rain squalls. The Coral Sea, named for the vibrant reefs dotting its waters, would become an arena where pilots became the primary weapons, where young aviators clutching outdated maps would navigate through clouds and flak to strike ships they glimpsed only briefly before releasing their deadly payloads. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon climbed into his SBD Dauntless dive bomber that morning, part of Lexington's air group, carrying orders to locate and destroy Japanese carriers. Like hundreds of other pilots preparing for launch, Dixon understood the stakes extended far beyond personal survival. The fate of Australia, the future of Allied resistance in the Pacific, and the lives of millions hung upon their success or failure in the coming hours. The 8th of May, 1942, dawned with oppressive humidity that left flight deck crews drenched in sweat before the sun fully cleared the horizon, while reconnaissance pilots launched into skies that promised both opportunity and catastrophe. Whoever struck first would likely survive, and whoever located the enemy carriers first would write the day's outcome in blood and aviation fuel. Fletcher's search planes fanned out across sectors of ocean, scanning for telltale wakes or the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese carriers. At approximately 08:15 hours, Lieutenant John Nielsen radioed contact reports from his Dauntless scout plane. He had spotted Takagi's carrier striking force. The message electrified both American carriers. Lexington and Yorktown immediately prepared maximum strike packages, arming torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts for what would become the Pacific War's first carrier duel. Japanese reconnaissance had achieved similar success. At nearly the same moment American pilots spotted Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japanese search planes identified the American task force. Both sides now raced against time, launching aircraft while knowing enemy bombers were simultaneously racing toward them. The mathematics of carrier warfare became brutally simple. Whichever fleet launched more aircraft faster, and whose pilots proved more skilled and fortunate, would survive the day. 93 American aircraft roared off Lexington's and Yorktown's flight decks, forming up in the humid tropical air before turning northwest toward the reported Japanese position. Commander William Ault led Lexington's strike group, while Lieutenant Commander William Birch commanded Yorktown's bombers. These men carried the responsibility of finding and destroying Japanese carriers that represented Japan's offensive capability. Floating fortresses that had ravaged Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 5 relentless months. Simultaneously, 70 Japanese aircraft launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku, their pilots equally determined and superbly trained. The two aerial armadas passed within miles of each other en route to their respective targets, like medieval armies marching to opposite ends of the same battlefield. Fighter pilots noticed enemy formations but continued toward primary objectives. Carriers were the prizes worth every tactical risk. At approximately 1100 hours, American dive bombers emerged from cloud cover above the Japanese carriers. Anti-aircraft fire erupted immediately, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. Dauntless pilots pushed over into near-vertical dives, screaming earthward through the flak at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. Shokaku twisted desperately, her captain ordering maximum rudder to evade the plummeting bombs. Lieutenant John Powers pressed his attack with legendary determination, diving so low that observers feared he would never pull out. His 1,000-pound bomb struck Shokaku's flight deck with devastating effect, penetrating deep into the carrier's interior before exploding. Fires erupted immediately. 2 more bombs followed within minutes, transforming Shokaku's forward flight deck into an inferno that prevented aircraft recovery. Though severely damaged, the carrier remained afloat. Her damage control teams performed heroically, containing fires that threatened ammunition magazines and aviation fuel stores. Zuikaku disappeared into a convenient rain squall, her captain demonstrating excellent seamanship that saved his vessel from American bombs. The protective weather allowed Zuikaku to escape relatively unscathed, preserving her combat capability while her sister ship burned. This tactical fortune would prove significant in subsequent battles. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft approached the American task force. Lexington and Yorktown maneuvered independently, their captains ordering radical turns to complicate bombing solutions. Combat Air Patrol Wildcats intercepted Japanese bombers, shooting down several attackers, but the sheer number of incoming aircraft overwhelmed American defenses. As documented in Theodore Taylor's detailed account, The Magnificent Mitcher, the coordination between Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers demonstrated sophisticated tactical doctrine that maximized defensive confusion. Yorktown's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, conned his ship brilliantly through the attack, evading all but one bomb that struck the carrier's flight deck. Damage control teams immediately contained the resulting fire, and within hours, Yorktown had resumed flight operations, a testament to American damage control training that would repeatedly save carriers throughout the Pacific War. Lexington proved less fortunate on that terrible 8th of May, 1942, when Japanese torpedo bombers divided into coordinated attack groups, approaching from multiple angles in a tactic called the Anvil Attack, that forced carrier captains into impossible choices. Turn toward one group of torpedoes while exposing the ship's vulnerable beam to another group arriving from the opposite direction. Captain Frederick Sherman ordered Lexington hard to port, attempting to comb the tracks of torpedoes racing through the crystalline water. The massive carrier responded sluggishly, at 880 feet long and displacing over 40,000 tons. Lexington maneuvered like a floating city rather than a nimble cruiser. 2 torpedoes struck her port side in rapid succession, sending geysers of water and debris skyward. The impacts shuddered through the carrier's frame, felt by every sailor aboard from the bridge to the engineering spaces 5 decks below. Simultaneously, dive bombers screamed down through anti-aircraft fire. A bomb penetrated the flight deck near the port forward gun gallery, exploding inside the ship and starting fires among aircraft parked below. Another bomb struck aft, causing additional casualties and damage. Yet Lexington remained operational. Damage control parties flooded compartments to correct the list. Firefighters battled blazes, and within 30 minutes the carrier had regained an even keel and resumed recovering aircraft. Pilots returning from the strike against Japanese carriers found their home ships bloodied but functional. They landed with fuel gauges registering near empty, many aircraft riddled with anti-aircraft damage. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, after attacking the light carrier Shoho the previous day, transmitted the famous message, "Scratch one flat top," that had electrified the fleet. Now, landing aboard wounded Lexington, Dixon witnessed firsthand the price of carrier warfare. Flight deck crews worked around bomb craters and fire damage to recover aircraft, while smoke still rose from internal fires. Below Lexington's hangar deck, however, catastrophe brewed unseen. Torpedo impacts had ruptured aviation fuel storage tanks, and gasoline vapors accumulated in compartments throughout the ship. At approximately 12:47 hours, a massive internal explosion ripped through Lexington's interior. Not from enemy action, but from accumulated fuel vapors ignited by a spark from electrical equipment. The explosion killed 25 men instantly and started uncontrollable fires that spread through ventilation systems. Additional explosions followed at irregular intervals, each one more devastating than the last. Aviation fuel fires generated intense heat that buckled steel decks and overwhelmed damage control efforts. Captain Sherman and his executive officer, Commander Morton Seligman, fought desperately to save their ship. But Lexington's internal architecture worked against them. The carrier had been designed before anyone fully understood aviation fuel's deadly properties. Inadequate compartmentalization allowed fires to spread rapidly through interconnected spaces. Admiral Fletcher, monitoring the situation from Yorktown, recognized that Lexington was doomed. At approximately 1700 hours, he authorized Sherman to abandon ship. The order devastated Lexington's crew. Sailors wept openly as they prepared to leave their beloved Lady Lex. Yet discipline held. The evacuation proceeded in remarkably orderly fashion, with wounded transferred first to escorting destroyers that came alongside the burning carrier. Photographer's mate. Second Class Thomas Glisson captured haunting images of the abandonment. Sailors lining up along Lexington's tilting flight deck, waiting their turn to climb down lines to destroyers below, while smoke and flames consumed the carrier's superstructure. According to records maintained at the Naval History and Heritage Command, Lexington's crew demonstrated extraordinary composure during the evacuation, with many pausing to salute the flag before abandoning ship. Captain Sherman remained aboard until last, walking through compartments to ensure no living sailors remained behind. He finally stepped off Lexington at approximately 1800 hours. Destroyer USS Phelps moved alongside the drifting carrier and fired torpedoes into her hull, ensuring she would not fall into Japanese hands. Lexington rolled onto her port side and slipped beneath the Coral Sea surface at approximately 2000 hours, taking with her 216 men who had perished during the battle. The 9th of May 1942 found both fleets withdrawing from the Coral Sea under sullen tropical skies, their commanders tallying losses and evaluating achievements while reconnaissance aircraft continued searching for enemy carriers that might resume combat. Though exhaustion and damage had effectively ended offensive operations for both sides, Admiral Fletcher steamed northward with Yorktown and his screening vessels, having lost Lexington but preserved the more modern carrier and most of her experienced air group. American casualties totaled approximately 543 killed, with dozens more wounded. Fletcher understood that by strict naval accounting, the Battle of the Coral Sea represented a tactical defeat. Japan had sunk a fleet carrier while losing only light carrier Shoho, plus Shokaku damaged but repairable. Yet strategic realities told a different story. The Japanese invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby had turned back. Vice Admiral Inoue, lacking carrier air cover after Shokaku's damage and Zuikaku's aircraft losses, judged the risk of continuing the invasion unacceptable. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese offensive momentum had been checked. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, preserving Australia's security and maintaining supply lines that would prove crucial for future operations. Admiral Takagi withdrew northward with his wounded carriers, satisfied that he had sunk Lexington, but troubled by the loss of numerous experienced pilots, men whose replacement would require months of training that Japan's accelerated wartime schedule could ill afford. Shokaku required extensive repairs that would keep her out of action for months. More significantly, Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and pilots that she could not operate effectively despite suffering minimal damage to the ship itself. This attrition of Japanese naval aviation would prove catastrophic within weeks. Admiral Yamamoto was planning Operation MI, the assault on Midway Island designed to destroy America's remaining carriers and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Yamamoto had counted on having 6 fleet carriers for Midway, but Shokaku's damage and Zuikaku's depleted air group meant only 4 carriers would participate. That 2-carrier deficit would contribute directly to Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway in June, when American dive bombers would sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single morning. American codebreakers continued monitoring Japanese naval communications, providing Admiral Nimitz with intelligence that confirmed Port Moresby's reprieve. Commander Rochefort's team at Station Hypo began detecting preparations for Yamamoto's next major operation, though the target remained ambiguous. Japanese communications referred to AF, without specifying the location. Rochefort brilliantly deduced that AF meant Midway, setting in motion the trap that would change the Pacific War's trajectory. The Battle of the Coral Sea demonstrated carrier warfare's unique characteristics. Unlike traditional naval battles where opposing battleships slugged out gunnery duels at ranges measured in miles, carrier combat occurred across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Admirals commanded battles they could not see, relying on radio reports from pilots and radar operators. Victory depended on reconnaissance luck, pilot skill, aircraft performance, and damage control capability, factors that introduced uncertainty into calculations previously dominated by gun caliber and armor thickness. Both sides learned valuable tactical lessons. American pilots discovered that coordinating torpedo bomber and dive bomber attacks maximized defensive confusion and hit probability. Japanese commanders recognized that aggressive fighter interception could break up bomber formations before they reached attack positions. Damage control emerged as crucial. Yorktown survived because her crew contained damage quickly, while Lexington sank from internal explosions hours after the attack ended. The battle also revealed equipment disparities. Japanese torpedoes worked reliably, while American torpedoes suffered from depth-keeping problems and defective exploders, issues that would plague U.S. submarines and torpedo bombers throughout 1942 and into 1943. Japanese aircraft generally outperformed American counterparts, particularly the legendary Zero fighter, though American pilots gradually developed tactics to neutralize the Zero's advantages. Admiral Nimitz, evaluating reports from Fletcher and intelligence summaries from Rochefort, recognized the battle's strategic significance even before all tactical details became clear. Japan's southward expansion had been halted. Australia remained secure. American carriers had proven they could challenge Japanese naval aviation and survive, even when tactically outnumbered. The psychological impact rippled through both fleets. American morale improved significantly after months of defeats, while Japanese commanders experienced their first doubts about inevitable victory. On the 10th of May, 1942, survivors from Lexington arrived at bases in New Caledonia and Australia, their dungarees still reeking of smoke and fuel oil, many suffering from burns and injuries that would hospitalize them for months, but all sharing stories of heroism and loss that would define their memories of the war forever. Seaman First Class Arthur Retchless described the chaos below decks when torpedoes struck Lexington's hull. He had been assigned to Damage Control Party Baker 3, stationed amidships near the forward elevator. The impact threw him against a bulkhead, briefly knocking him unconscious. When he recovered, water was flooding into compartments through ruptured plating, and the emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red illumination. His team worked frantically to shore damaged bulkheads and close watertight doors, isolating flooded compartments to preserve the ship's buoyancy. Lieutenant Ralph Cousins, a dive bomber pilot from Lexington's Air Group, had returned from the strike against Shokaku with his aircraft damaged and fuel nearly exhausted. He trapped aboard Lexington just as damage control parties were fighting fires from the bomb hit near the forward gun gallery. After securing his aircraft, Cousins immediately volunteered to help firefighting efforts, joining sailors hauling hoses and fighting flames for hours until the internal explosions forced abandonment. His actions typified the spirit throughout the fleet, officers and enlisted men working together without regard for rank, united by the desperate need to save their ship. Pharmacist's mate. Second Class William Brooks worked in Lexington's forward battle dressing station when the first explosion ripped through the ship. Wounded sailors flooded the medical spaces, men with flash burns covering their bodies, others with shrapnel wounds or injuries from being thrown against equipment. Brooks and the ship's doctors worked under deteriorating conditions as subsequent explosions shook the carrier and smoke filled the compartments. They continued treating wounded even as evacuation orders arrived, ensuring every injured sailor could be moved topside for transfer to destroyers. Japanese survivors had their own stories of courage and loss. Lieutenant Takahashi Iyozo, a dive bomber pilot from Shokaku, had pressed his attack on Lexington despite intense anti-aircraft fire that holed his aircraft in multiple places. He released his bomb from low altitude, convinced he had scored a direct hit, then fought his damaged aircraft back toward Shokaku. When he arrived, he discovered his carrier burning from American bomb hits, her flight deck too damaged to recover aircraft. Takahashi and other homeless pilots diverted to Zuikaku, landing aboard with fuel exhausted and nerves shattered. Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, who led the Japanese airstrike against the American carriers, returned to discover Shokaku ablaze and many of his squadron mates missing. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 70 planes, not merely machines, but each representing a highly trained pilot whose replacement would require 2 years of peacetime training that Japan's wartime schedule had compressed into months. These losses would hollow out Japanese naval aviation, creating an experience deficit that would become catastrophic at Midway. Aboard the destroyers rescuing Lexington's survivors, sailors shared cramped quarters with shipwrecked comrades. Destroyer crews provided clothing, food, and medical care, stretching their limited resources to accommodate hundreds of unexpected guests. USS Morris took aboard over 400 survivors, nearly doubling her normal complement. Morris's crew surrendered their bunks to Lexington survivors, sleeping on deck themselves, a gesture of solidarity that demonstrated the bonds linking all fleet sailors regardless of ship assignment. Chaplain Walter Mahler from Lexington conducted memorial services aboard the rescue destroyers for shipmates who had perished. The services were brief, wartime conditions permitted little ceremony, but Mahler's words provided comfort to survivors struggling with guilt about living when others had died. Many sailors wept openly during the services, releasing emotions suppressed during the desperate hours of firefighting and abandonment. Letters home from survivors revealed the psychological impact of losing their ship. Radioman Second Class James Welch wrote to his parents in Iowa describing the abandonment. "We stood in lines along the flight deck, waiting our turn to climb down ropes to the destroyers below. Lady Lex was burning behind us and we could feel the heat from the fires. When my turn came, I looked back at the ship one more time and saluted. Then I climbed down that rope faster than I've ever moved in my life. I was scared, but also sad. Lexington was our home." In the weeks following the battle on the 28th of May, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz sat in his office at Pearl Harbor reviewing Fletcher's action reports and intelligence assessments, recognizing that this strange new form of warfare demanded radically different command approaches than the battleship tactics that had dominated naval strategy for generations. And he understood that victory in the Pacific would belong to whichever side learned faster and adapted more effectively. Nimitz's analysis focused on carrier doctrine's evolution. The Battle of the Coral Sea had proven that carriers could not operate effectively without adequate reconnaissance. Both sides had struggled to locate enemy forces across vast ocean expanses. Intelligence from code breaking had provided Americans with strategic advantage, but tactical success still required finding the enemy fleet in real time. Nimitz ordered improvements to search procedures, including expanded reconnaissance sectors and better coordination between carrier-based scouts and long-range patrol aircraft. The battle also demonstrated fighter escorts' critical importance. American strike groups had suffered significant losses to Japanese Zeros during both the attack on Japanese carriers and the return flight to their own ships. Nimitz directed fighter escort increases for bombing missions, even though this reduced the number of bombers each strike could include. Better to deliver fewer bombers to the target than lose them all to enemy fighters en route. Admiral Fletcher submitted detailed reports analyzing his decisions throughout the battle. He defended his cautious approach to refueling operations early in the engagement, noting that depleted fuel supplies would have prevented Yorktown from participating in subsequent operations, including the upcoming Midway battle. Fletcher also addressed criticism that American strikes had been poorly coordinated, acknowledging that Lexington's and Yorktown's air groups had attacked separately, rather than in a concentrated mass. He recommended improved inter-carrier communication procedures to better coordinate strike launches in future battles. On the Japanese side, Admiral Yamamoto convened conferences with his staff and carrier division commanders to evaluate lessons from the Coral Sea. While satisfied with the tactical outcome, sinking a fleet carrier while losing only light carrier Shoho, Yamamoto recognized disturbing trends. American resistance had proven more effective than expected. The enemy carriers had escaped destruction despite being engaged by superior Japanese forces. Most troubling, the Port Moresby invasion had been cancelled, representing Japan's first strategic setback since the war began. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who would command the carrier striking force at Midway, studied action reports from Takagi's carriers with growing concern. American pilots had demonstrated improving skill and determination. The coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers, while not yet perfected, showed dangerous potential. Nagumo recommended enhanced fighter patrol procedures and better damage control training, lessons that would be implemented too late to save his carriers at Midway. Japanese naval aviation losses at Coral Sea created ripples throughout the fleet. The combined fleet entered the Midway operation with fewer experienced pilots than planned, and the absence of Shokaku and Zuikaku reduced carrier strength by 1/3. These deficits would prove decisive when American dive bombers caught Nagumo's carriers rearming their aircraft during the critical 5 minutes that determined the battle's outcome. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet in Washington, examined the battle from a global strategic perspective. King recognized that every Japanese carrier damaged or sunk brought America closer to parity in the Pacific. He directed the Navy Department to accelerate carrier construction programs, particularly the Essex-class fleet carriers that would begin entering service in 1943. King also emphasized pilot training expansion. American flight schools would need to produce thousands of aviators to crew the carriers under construction. The Battle of the Coral Sea influenced broader Allied strategy in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, recognized that Japanese naval power could still project force anywhere within range of their carriers. MacArthur argued for increased land-based air power to supplement carrier forces, leading to expansion of Army Air Force units in Australia and New Guinea. The subsequent campaigns to secure New Guinea and advance toward the Philippines would rely on this combination of carrier-based and land-based aviation. Churchill and Roosevelt, coordinating global Allied strategy, noted with relief that Australia had been secured from immediate invasion threat. The Coral Sea battle demonstrated that American forces could challenge Japanese expansion despite lacking numerical superiority. This encouraged Allied leaders to maintain their Germany first strategic priority, while still allocating sufficient resources to prevent complete Japanese domination of the Pacific. The balance remained precarious throughout 1942. But the Coral Sea provided evidence that balanced resource allocation could succeed in both theaters. Nimitz synthesized lessons from the Coral Sea into guidance for future operations. He emphasized concentration of force, keeping carriers together to mass their striking power, rather than dispersing them on separate missions. He directed improvements in damage control training, citing Yorktown's survival versus Lexington's loss as evidence that crew training could determine whether damaged carriers survived or sank. He also pushed for better anti-aircraft capabilities, recognizing that defeating enemy airstrikes before they reached bombing positions was preferable to relying solely on evasive maneuvering. By mid-June 1942, American and Japanese engineers were analyzing battle damage reports and combat performance data from the Coral Sea, seeking technological advantages that might tip future carrier battles in their favor, knowing that incremental improvements in aircraft performance, radar capabilities, or damage control techniques could mean the difference between victory and annihilation when fleets clashed again. American aircraft manufacturers received urgent feedback from Navy pilots regarding combat performance against Japanese aircraft. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter, while rugged and dependable, was outmatched by the nimble Zero in turning combat. Pilots reported that diving attacks and hit-and-run tactics worked better than trying to dogfight Japanese fighters. This feedback influenced Grumman's development of the F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero with superior speed, firepower, and armor protection, while accepting slightly reduced maneuverability. Douglas Aircraft Company analyzed reports about the SBD Dauntless dive bomber's performance. Pilots praised the aircraft's stability during dives and its rugged construction that survived battle damage, but requested more speed and range. These recommendations influenced subsequent Dauntless variants and eventually led to the SB-2C Helldiver's development, though the Helldiver's troubled introduction meant Dauntlesses would remain frontline aircraft through 1944. American torpedo bomber performance presented serious problems. The Douglas TBD Devastator had proven slow, poorly protected, and vulnerable to fighter attack. Worse, even when Devastators successfully penetrated defenses and dropped torpedoes, the Mark 13 torpedo suffered from terrible reliability. Torpedoes ran too deep, missing targets entirely, or struck ships without exploding due to defective contact exploders. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted acknowledging these problems, creating frustration throughout the fleet. Not until mid-1943 would the torpedo reliability crisis be adequately addressed. Radar technology emerged as a critical capability requiring rapid improvement. American carriers were equipped with CXAM radar that could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing early warning of incoming attacks. However, fighter direction, the art of using radar data to guide interceptors to enemy bombers, remained primitive. Combat information centers aboard carriers needed better equipment and training to translate radar contacts into effective fighter interceptions. The Coral Sea experience accelerated development of improved radar systems and fighter direction procedures that would prove invaluable in later battles. Japanese engineers faced different challenges. Zero fighters had dominated early war aerial combat, but combat reports from the Coral Sea indicated American pilots were developing tactics to neutralize the Zero's advantages. Japanese designers began work on more heavily armed variants and eventually on successor aircraft like the Shiden, though wartime production constraints would limit these developments' impact. Damage control emerged as perhaps the most significant technological and organizational challenge. Lexington's loss from internal explosions hours after the battle ended shocked American naval leadership. Investigation revealed that pre-war carrier designs had inadequate compartmentalization and insufficient protection for aviation fuel systems. Gasoline vapor accumulation in enclosed spaces created floating bombs that a single spark could detonate. The Navy directed immediate modifications to surviving carriers, improving ventilation systems, installing better fire suppression equipment, and retraining damage control parties. Japanese carriers also suffered from design vulnerabilities, though different from American problems. Shokaku's damage at Coral Sea revealed that Japanese carriers lacked the armored flight decks that British carriers employed. Bombs that penetrated flight decks could wreak havoc in hangar spaces filled with aircraft ammunition and aviation fuel. Japanese carriers also stored more ordnance on hangar decks than American practice allowed, increasing explosion risk. These vulnerabilities would prove catastrophic at Midway when multiple bomb hits ignited chain reactions that destroyed 4 carriers in minutes. Communication systems required improvement on both sides. Coordinating multi-carrier strike groups proved difficult with existing radio equipment. Fighter direction demanded reliable communication between carriers and orbiting fighters. Strike leaders needed to communicate with attacking aircraft while maintaining radio silence to avoid alerting enemy defenses. The Coral Sea battle exposed all these communication challenges, spurring development of better radio equipment and communication procedures. Anti-aircraft systems underwent rapid evolution in response to combat experience. Both American and Japanese ships mounted various combinations of heavy, medium, and light anti-aircraft weapons, but fire control systems remained relatively primitive. Computing solutions for shooting at fast-moving aircraft while the firing ship maneuvered violently challenged existing technology. American development of the VT proximity fuse, a shell that exploded automatically when passing near aircraft, would eventually revolutionize anti-aircraft defense, though this technology would not reach the fleet until 1943. Aircraft carrier design philosophy diverged between American and Japanese approaches. American carriers emphasized operational flexibility, damage control capability, and the ability to sustain high-tempo operations. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive striking power, accepting reduced defensive capabilities to maximize the size and quality of air groups. These different philosophies reflected each nation's strategic situation. Japan needed to win decisive battles quickly, while America could afford a longer war of attrition if its carriers could survive to fight repeatedly. Throughout June and July of 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea's consequences rippled across the Pacific theater, influencing operations from New Guinea to the Aleutians, reshaping command relationships and strategic planning in ways that neither side had fully anticipated when their carriers first clashed in those tropical waters 2 months earlier. In Australia, the battle's outcome generated enormous relief mixed with recognition of how narrow the margin had been. Prime Minister John Curtin's government had feared imminent Japanese invasion. Enemy aircraft had bombed Darwin repeatedly. Submarines prowled Australian waters, and Japanese ground forces were advancing through New Guinea's jungles toward Port Moresby. The Coral Sea battle's strategic success, despite Lexington's loss, demonstrated that Allied naval power could still contest Japanese expansion. This bolstered Australian morale and reinforced Curtin's commitment to the Allied cause. MacArthur leveraged the breathing space provided by the battle to strengthen defenses throughout the Southwest Pacific area. Army engineers constructed airfields across northern Australia and New Guinea, creating a network of bases for land-based bombers and fighters that could supplement carrier aviation. Infantry divisions trained for jungle warfare, preparing for the grinding campaigns that would eventually push Japanese forces back through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. In New Guinea itself, the battle had immediate tactical consequences. Japanese forces attempting to advance overland toward Port Moresby through the Owen Stanley Mountains now lacked naval support and air superiority. Australian troops, initially falling back before superior Japanese numbers, received reinforcements and supplies that allowed them to stabilize defensive positions. The subsequent Kokoda Track campaign would prove brutal, but Australian and American forces eventually halted Japanese advances and began pushing them back toward the northern coast. The Midway operation, scheduled for early June, proceeded despite Shokaku's and Zuikaku's absence. Admiral Yamamoto believed overwhelming force, 4 fleet carriers, plus battleship and cruiser support, would suffice to destroy America's remaining carriers and seize Midway Island. He failed to appreciate how significantly the 2-carrier deficit reduced his striking power and, more critically, how American codebreakers had provided Nimitz with complete knowledge of Japanese plans. Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, limped into Pearl Harbor requiring repairs that would normally take months. Nimitz ordered round-the-clock repair work, and Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers performed miracles, patching damage sufficiently for Yorktown to sail within 3 days. This extraordinary effort, driven by code-breaking intelligence indicating Midway's criticality, gave Nimitz 3 carriers instead of 2 for the upcoming battle. Yorktown would be sunk at Midway, but not before her aircraft contributed to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers, a trade that fundamentally shifted the Pacific War's balance. Japanese strategic planning began exhibiting the first signs of confusion that would increasingly characterize their decision-making as the war progressed. The combined fleet staff debated whether to continue offensive operations toward Australia or focus on consolidating defensive perimeters. Some officers argued for invading Hawaii. Others wanted to attack India. Still others advocated securing the South Pacific. These diverging strategic visions reflected Japan's fundamental problem: insufficient resources to simultaneously defend conquered territories while continuing offensive operations. American strategy, by contrast, gained coherence from the defensive successes at Coral Sea and Midway. Admiral King and the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a limited offensive in the Solomon Islands, targeting the Japanese base at Guadalcanal. This operation, launched in August 1942, would begin America's grinding advance across the Pacific, an island-hopping campaign that leveraged American industrial superiority to gradually overwhelm Japanese defenses. The psychological impact of Coral Sea extended beyond military circles. American newspapers, while acknowledging Lexington's loss, emphasized the strategic victory of turning back Japan's invasion convoy. Headlines proclaimed, "Japs halted" and "Australia saved," providing the American public with its first genuinely positive news since Pearl Harbor. This morale boost proved significant. Americans had endured 6 months of defeats, and the Coral Sea demonstrated that Japanese forces could be stopped and that American servicemen could fight effectively against experienced enemy forces. Japanese media, controlled by military censors, presented Coral Sea as a decisive victory. One American carrier sunk, another damaged, enemy forces driven from the area. The censors concealed Shoho's loss and minimized Shokaku's damage. These distortions created false confidence among Japanese civilians about the war's progress, delaying the day when Japanese leadership would need to confront uncomfortable truths about declining combat effectiveness and resource shortages. The battle influenced Allied grand strategy in subtle but important ways. Churchill, always concerned about maintaining British positions in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, noted with approval that American carriers were effectively containing Japanese naval power in the Central and South Pacific. This allowed Britain to focus limited resources on defending India and Ceylon, while preparing for eventual offensives to recapture Burma and Malaya. By December 1942, 7 months after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Pacific War had fundamentally transformed from the conflict it had been in May. New carriers were joining both fleets. Tactical doctrines had evolved through hard combat experience, and both sides had learned that carrier warfare demanded innovation, courage, and adaptation on scales previously unimaginable. The Coral Sea had demonstrated that carrier versus carrier combat would define the Pacific War's naval dimension. Battleships, the massive gunned fortresses that had dominated naval thinking for generations, had become supporting players. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, floating airports that projected power across hundreds of miles through their air groups. This fundamental shift transformed naval strategy, requiring admirals to think not in terms of gun range and armor thickness, but in terms of reconnaissance range, strike radius, and the number of sorties their air groups could sustain. American carrier construction accelerated dramatically following the Coral Sea battle. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction when war began, received highest priority. These ships incorporated lessons from early war combat: better armor protection, improved damage control systems, enhanced anti-aircraft batteries, and larger air groups. USS Essex herself would commission in December 1942, followed by dozens of sister ships that would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer numerical superiority. The Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, provided additional flight decks that could support fleet operations, while the heavy carriers conducted strikes. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, struggled to replace carrier losses. Industrial capacity limitations, raw material shortages, and competing demands from Army and merchant ship construction prevented Japan from matching American production rates. The carriers sunk at Midway. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would never be adequately replaced. Japan would complete some new carriers during 1943 and 1944, but these ships would lack experienced air groups, and many would be sunk before conducting significant operations. The pilot training pipeline emerged as perhaps the most critical long-term consequence of the Coral Sea battle. American flight training programs expanded massively throughout 1942, establishing new airfields across the United States dedicated to producing thousands of naval aviators. Training standards remained high. The Navy refused to sacrifice quality for quantity, but improved training methods and increased instructor numbers allowed sustained high-quality output. By 1944, American carriers would deploy with air groups where even the newest pilots had hundreds of training hours and arrived combat-ready. Japanese naval aviation, conversely, entered a death spiral from which it never recovered. Pre-war pilot training had produced superbly skilled aviators, but the programs required years to complete and could not scale to meet wartime demands. Losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and subsequent battles killed or wounded irreplaceable veteran pilots. Japan attempted to accelerate training programs, but shortened courses produced inadequately prepared pilots who died quickly in combat, creating a vicious cycle of declining skill and increasing losses. By 1944, Japanese pilot quality had deteriorated so severely that kamikaze tactics, deliberate suicide attacks, became a rational response to inability to execute conventional attacks effectively. The tactical innovations pioneered at Coral Sea influenced every subsequent carrier battle. Coordinated dive bomber and torpedo bomber attacks became standard American doctrine, refined through combat experience at Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and Philippine Sea. Fighter escort tactics evolved to protect strike groups while still maintaining combat air patrol over friendly carriers. Radar-directed fighter interception improved dramatically, transforming from primitive attempts at Coral Sea to sophisticated direction that could guide fighters to intercept enemy aircraft at maximum distance from carriers. Damage control became an American naval specialty. The lessons from Lexington's loss drove systematic improvements in training, equipment, and procedures. American damage control parties trained relentlessly, drilling on fighting fires, controlling flooding, and maintaining ship stability under battle conditions. This training repeatedly saved damaged carriers, Yorktown at Midway, Enterprise at Eastern Solomons, Franklin later in the war, allowing them to return to action rather than sinking. Japanese damage control, while competent, never achieved the same systematic excellence that characterized American practice. The strategic significance of the Coral Sea battle became clearer with historical distance. Japan's failure to capture Port Moresby represented the high-water mark of Japanese expansion. Every subsequent operation would be defensive or reactive, rather than part of a coherent offensive strategy. Australia remained secure as a base for Allied operations, allowing MacArthur to build the forces necessary for the New Guinea and Philippines campaigns. The supply lines connecting America to Australia remained open, enabling the flow of troops and equipment that would eventually overwhelm Japanese defenses. Naval historians would later identify the Coral Sea as the first battle in the Pacific War, where Japanese losses exceeded their ability to replace them promptly. Shoho could not be replaced. Japan had few light carriers and could not spare construction capacity for more. Shokaku's extended repair period and Zuikaku's air group losses removed two-thirds of a carrier division from service during the critical Midway period. Japanese naval aviation losses, over 70 aircraft and their highly trained crews, represented attrition Japan could not sustain while maintaining operational effectiveness. The battle also demonstrated intelligence's critical importance in modern warfare. American code-breaking had provided strategic warning that allowed Nimitz to position carriers to intercept the Japanese offensive. This intelligence advantage would continue throughout the war, with Station Hypo and other code-breaking centers, providing American commanders with insights into Japanese intentions that compensated for numerical inferiority. At Midway, intelligence would prove even more decisive, allowing Nimitz to ambush Yamamoto's fleet despite being outnumbered. International perceptions of the Pacific War shifted following Coral Sea. British and Soviet observers, focused primarily on the European theater, recognized that American naval forces were effectively contesting Japanese expansion. This reduced pressure on Roosevelt to divert additional resources from the Atlantic and European campaigns, allowing the Germany First strategy to proceed while still maintaining adequate forces in the Pacific. The balance remained precarious, but Coral Sea demonstrated that the existing resource allocation could achieve strategic objectives in both theaters. Survivors of the battle carried their experiences throughout the war and into peacetime. Many returned to combat aboard other ships, bringing lessons learned at Coral Sea to subsequent battles. Some became instructors, training new pilots and sailors in carrier operations. Others rose to command positions, applying tactical innovations developed during those desperate days in May 1942 to later campaigns. The Battle of the Coral Sea had forged a generation of naval warriors who understood carrier warfare's realities in ways that no peacetime training could teach. The memorial services conducted years later would honor the 543 American sailors and airmen who died at Coral Sea, along with the thousands of Japanese servicemen who perished in the battle. These men had fought the first carrier versus carrier engagement in naval history, pioneering a form of warfare that would dominate the Pacific War and influence naval strategy into the 21st century. Their sacrifice had secured Australia, halted Japanese expansion, and established that American forces could challenge Japanese naval superiority despite lacking numerical advantage. Lexington's wreck lies today in the Coral Sea, 3 kilometers below the surface, resting in darkness far from the sunlight that illuminated her final hours. Her loss represented the price of strategic victory. A fleet carrier and 216 men traded for halting Japanese momentum at the critical moment when Australia's survival hung in the balance. The calculus seems cold when stated so starkly, yet war demands such terrible arithmetic, and those who made the calculations understood what stakes they played for. The Battle of the Coral Sea demonstrated that carrier warfare had fundamentally transformed naval combat. Ships would never again see each other while exchanging fire. The decisive weapons were aircraft launched from floating airfields, guided by radar and radio, striking targets beyond the horizon. Admirals commanded battles they could not observe directly, dependent on reconnaissance reports and pilot communications to understand the tactical situation. Victory belonged to whichever side found the enemy first, launched strikes fastest, and whose pilots demonstrated superior skill and courage when pressing attacks through defensive fire. In the end, the Battle of the Coral Sea achieved what it needed to achieve. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. Australia was secured from invasion. Japanese offensive momentum was checked for the first time. American carriers and their crews proved they could fight effectively against experienced Japanese forces. The price was heavy. Lexington gone, hundreds dead, many more wounded, but the alternative would have been catastrophically worse. Had Japan captured Port Moresby, had the invasion convoy reached its objective, the entire strategic situation in the South Pacific would have collapsed, potentially forcing Australia to consider negotiated peace and severing the supply lines essential for America's eventual offensive. The young men who flew through tropical skies that May in 1942, the sailors who fought fires and flooding aboard damaged carriers, the admirals who made impossible decisions with incomplete information, all of them participated in establishing principles of carrier warfare that would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Their courage, sacrifice, and innovation during those desperate days transformed naval combat forever, proving that carriers would dominate naval warfare for generations to come, and that the nation possessing superior carriers, pilots, and tactics would control the seas and ultimately achieve victory in the vast Pacific theater.